said, take a break about halfway through. And the nice thing that I find about doing these is that when we have a somewhat smaller group, it's kind of nice to be able to just see you guys and have a smaller conversation. So, depending on kind of where we wrap up today, we can maybe just sort of open it. Until then, I'm going to have you guys just, keep your mics muted. I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. And I'm really glad that we get to take our time a little bit with this. So, as Kevin said, we'll be doing part 1 this week and we'll do part 2 next week. So, let's go ahead and we're going to start with what is sort of the most nerve-wracking part for me, which is sharing my screen. And so now I just need to pull these up and then get that slideshow going. And we just need to check that thing to get rid of that. They always put the little toolbars like right where you need to actually click something else. So I think we're good there. Okay, so we're going to click through these and we're going to get to, oh, that's for something else. Okay, so we're going to get to one of my favorite ways to start this. And it's really kind of my way of laying the groundwork for how I talk about trauma. And it's important to know my background before we get into this. So I'm actually a psychotherapist, and I've been working in the mental health world for years. Just a super long time. We don't need to get into specific numbers. And yes, I'm very youthful looking. Thank you, everyone, for noticing that. And so when I got an opportunity, actually working with Kevin at the state of Ohio, where he ran policy for the Department of Developmental Disabilities, I came on sort of as a liaison between mental health and developmental disabilities. And it was very exciting for me, but it was also sort of nerve-wracking because I really have not worked a lot directly with folks with developmental disabilities. I had a little bit here and there, but it certainly wasn't what I would consider my area of expertise. And so I got to learn a lot, and it was really fun. And I got to travel around Ohio and meet lots of different providers like you guys and hear how you were working with people with developmental disabilities. And at the time, which was 2009, 2010, trauma was really not the conversation in DD that it is now. So it's been very exciting to see that evolution over the years. But as we get a little further into this, I'll talk about how in the mental health world, we've known some things about how trauma can present in lots of different ways that I think we are still kind of learning about in developmental disabilities. And more importantly, the thing that I became more and more passionate about and convinced about as a trauma therapist is that while the specifics of trauma can be very different, and we do sometimes work with different populations a little bit differently in terms of, people with combat PTSD or people who've lost someone to a traumatic event. There are some specifics about those situations, and it is nice sometimes to honor those and to, for example, just be in a group where everyone in that group can relate to some piece of that. But underneath that, there's a deeper layer. And for me, that layer is universality. That when we talk about when a human being has felt powerless or frightened or out of control, there are only so many ways that the body and the brain and the nervous system can respond to that. And so having a developmental disability, I certainly think can impact how someone understands what's happening, or probably more importantly, how they convey to other people what's happening, how other people hear them, and whether or not we hear their truth or we don't hear their truth. But when we talk about the level of the psyche and the nervous system and the body and the brain, we have far, far, far more in common than we do things that are different. And so you'll notice as we spend this time together today and next week, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about developmental disabilities and trauma as if it's some completely different thing. Because A, I don't think that's what the science supports, and B, because that's another way for us to create distance, right? What's happening with you is very different than something that might happen to me. And we know that that simply is not correct. And I think as I said, can lead to that distancing or othering that makes it even harder to be present for and respond compassionately and skillfully when someone is experiencing some residue of traumatic stress. And so that's how I always introduce myself with audiences. And that also explains the quotes that I've chosen to start this presentation. So we'll go through them. The first one is probably a name you're not familiar with. Tamsin Cottis is actually English, and she is, or was at the time anyway, a director of an entire mental health clinic just for people with developmental disabilities. And I always like pausing and kind of thinking about that for a minute. Imagine what that would be like if you could refer someone to, I don't know, a place in Cleveland or Dayton or Columbus or Cincinnati, and it's an entire mental health agency just for people with dual diagnosis. That would be pretty amazing. But anyway, she wrote a really fascinating book about this. And this is how she talked about the interplay between developmental disabilities and trauma, post-traumatic stress, for the clients referred to them. And she said this: it is worth noting at this point that many patients referred to her clinic seem to have become disabled more by their traumatic life experience than by any congenital impairment. Now, it's a short quote, so it's easy to sort of breeze past it. I want to just sit there with that for a moment. That the folks that we work with potentially have more barriers and more struggle and are more affected by trauma. And in the vast majority of their cases, we're talking about interpersonal trauma, the way they have been treated by another human being. We're usually not talking about a plane crash or a car accident or something like that. We could be, but mostly we're talking about their experiences with other people. Imagine that we treated this quote as the way that we need to offer services. So imagine that I am the first person at, it's my first interaction at a county board or my first introduction to a provider agency or what have you. And all planning and assessment starts with my experiences with other people, if they're known, and what seems to help me feel safe and what seems to help make me feel not safe. And that's where planning begins. That's the heart of it. And I'm not saying things like, what's my syndrome? What's my, support needs? What's my IQ? How did I perform on this test or that? I'm not saying that that information isn't important, but what if that came second? And the first thing that you ask to know about me and the first thing that you read about in my file is my trauma history. I certainly, just speaking for the state of Ohio, although I think this is true across the country, that would really turn service planning on its head. We've seen wonderful gains in terms of making trauma a part of an assessment or a part of a screening, or when someone seems to be struggling, we've known some people that will do like a trauma support plan. In fact, we created a trauma support plan for people, and I think that's great. But it's not the same as this is the first and most important thing we need to know about somebody to understand how best to support them. So it's deceptively simple, but it's actually a really radical statement, I think. And then the second one, I don't know how many folks in the audience have had any trauma-informed care training. You can put that in the Q&A section or something. We can take a look at that. As I said, when I first started doing this, a few hands would go up. If I were talking to a large audience of people in developmental disabilities, I would see a few hands. Now, when we are speaking in Ohio or traveling around the country, I usually see many more hands, which is very exciting. And some folks, if they have a mental health background or if this has been an area of interest for you, this name, Bessel van der Kolk, may be familiar to you. He is easily the most well-known trauma writer and trauma therapist and trauma researcher probably in the world right now. And in fact, he wrote a book that you may have heard of because it's widely popular. It's been a bestseller for years, and it's called The Body Keeps the Score. If this is something that you are interested in learning more about, I always recommend starting with him. In fact, when I taught trauma at the MSW program at Ohio State, That is one of the books that I decided was going to be the textbooks for my class, among a couple of others. So I always highly recommend this. He does a really good job of sort of encapsulating basically what we think we know about trauma up to this point and where trauma therapy is heading. And I had the opportunity to see him at a training, and this is what he said. He said, in fact, the past is the past. And the only thing that matters, right, is what happens right now. And what is trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. And it's not that event out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. And you will do anything to make them go away. Now, again, he's packed kind of a lot into a short paragraph, so we're going to break this down a little bit. The first part I think that's really important is right at the beginning when he says, the past is the past, and the only thing that matters is what's happening right now. And that can be a little counterintuitive, right? Because usually in the work that we are doing, unless you are a trauma responder or you're doing trauma interventions like right on the battlefield or something like that, you are by definition dealing with or trying to accommodate something that happened before. It's not happening right now. And in fact, that leads to a very understandable, very common, but what I think is often a very damaging misconception that people are likely to have. And that is, well, the trauma happened in the past, so why don't you just forget about it? You know, or you just need closure, or why don't you just let it go? And for those of you who are parents, I will reassure you right now at this moment and say, I am not about to sing Let It Go. So don't worry. Um, but if you've worked with trauma or you've known anyone perhaps in your personal life or your family, or if it's anything that you would sometime have grappled with, you know that the reaction to like, oh, just let it go is like, oh, great idea. I wish I'd thought of that. I just have to not think about it. Oh, great. I never tried that. Um, and of course, uh, if that worked, we would not be doing this training. And there would be a lot of people who would be profoundly grateful to just not think about it. And that, of course, is not the case. So the reason that it's so important that we are talking about this is that the roles that you guys play, and I haven't had a chance to meet everybody in the audience and what you guys do, but I already know this about you. The role that you play, whether you're a direct service professional or a manager or an SSA or whatever it is, you are often in some form or another the ambassador to the rest of the world for that individual that you support. Maybe you help the family understand their family member. Maybe you are talking to an employer. Maybe you are working to help this person live independently and you're talking with the landlord. It really doesn't matter. The point is, um, you may be the person who is best positioned to help other people understand that getting Lara to just not think about it really is not the answer. And while that may seem obvious to us, it can sneak its way in lots of different ways. So, for example, think about how many behavior plans might say, if Lara gets triggered, redirect her. And I get it. And that's a longer conversation about behavioral planning. And that would be a much bigger conversation than we would have today. I would simply point out that if you are dealing with someone and someone says, why don't you just distract yourself? That might not be a bad strategy in the moment if you need to go do something, but in terms of long-term healing, that really profoundly misses the point, doesn't it? And so I do think that in our field, we sometimes have to remind ourselves, and we often have to help other people in the individual's life understand this is not about the past. It's about what continues to come up now. If it were only in the past, this would not be a problem. So that's the first really important thing I think that he says. The second thing that he mentions is your own sensory experiences, and that really starts to ground us in the body. We tend to think about trauma as something that we think about or that we remember, and there are elements of that. But in the short time that I have with you guys over the next week, we will talk about the fact that trauma is actually an entire whole body experience. It is a neurological event. It is not just something that we sometimes think about. And then the next thing he says is that it's not the event out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. And in order to talk more about that, I want to share a story that was told to me, and this is out of my own life. When I was in college, uh, long ago, I had a professor who, in fact, became one of my advisors when I was in graduate school. And like a lot of young men of his generation, he had grown up in a rural county in Ohio, and like a lot of people in his family and a lot of people around him, he volunteered to serve his country during the Vietnam War. And his job there was to be a medic. So for 1 year, he had the job of being at a base medical camp somewhere, and then a call would come in over the radio and they would jump into a helicopter and fly to where the fighting had been. Often they were flying through very, very thick, like jungle canopy trees. And if the pilot hit a rotor on one of those trees and it broke, they would have crashed and died immediately. They would go to where the fighting was. Sometimes there was anti-aircraft fire. They would land, hopefully not landing on a landmine, because then they would blow up and everyone would be dead instantly. They would jump out of the helicopter, they would run to where the soldiers were and go to try to grab them to get them onto the chopper. And I will not describe to you what he said would sometimes happen when they would go to try to pull those bodies away. And then they would get them on the helicopter and take off and fight desperately to keep the soldiers alive on that flight back to the medical base. Needless to say, many soldiers did not survive that flight. And I will also not describe to you what he told us about what he saw and heard and experienced in that helicopter on that flight back. So that was his job every day for a year. And then he came home and finished his education and eventually became a therapist and a professor and married a nice lady. And one day he and his wife decided to go to the movies. And the movie that they came to see in a theater here somewhere in Columbus is called The Deer Hunter. And this is an older movie now. Some of you guys may not be familiar with it, but it was one of the first very graphic, very realistic depictions of that war. And what he told his students for generations after was that he no longer knows, did not, his brain did not record the information of what exactly had happened on the screen, what he heard, what he saw. He did not have that information. What he did know was that one moment he was sitting next to his wife, a PhD and a therapist, watching a movie. And the next thing he knew, he was crouched in the middle of the theater aisle, screaming, incoming, while his wife and the usher were dragging him out of the movie theater. So, you guys, I think, did not know him personally, and he's since passed away. So you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you that he did not choose to do that. That was not a decision that he made to disrupt a theater full of strangers, terrify his wife, and humiliate himself. And that might seem really obvious to you. Like, well, of course, who would do that? But I want to take a minute and I want you to ask yourself, what if we change the details of that story a little bit? And instead of a PhD professor, he was an individual in a group home who was out on an outing, or maybe a kid in a special ed classroom and they'd gone out to the movies. And that individual, that young person had started screaming and had to be dragged from the theater. What would he or she be told when they got back to the group home or the classroom? I think we know, right? That person would be told some version of, well, that's the end of privileges for you for a while. And why would that be? Well, it's because of your poor choices, right? Or it's because of your behavior. And so I want to pause here to make a point about that. As we spend time looking a little bit at the brain and the nervous system about what happens when people are having that momentary re-experiencing of that event, is that number one, the part of the brain that makes decisions is relatively shut down. And number two, imagine the horror or the terror that it would take to make you leap straight up out of a movie theater seat and crouch down in the middle of the aisle and start screaming. What would that be? When you think about that potentially happening, and perhaps you don't always know when or why, and how excruciating that would feel. Well, now start thinking about what you would be willing to do to make that not happen. I can tell you what I would be willing to do. Okay. If I had no other options to not feel that, I would be willing to drink too much, use drugs, overeat, starve myself, compulsively shop, compulsively gamble, hurt myself, cut myself, bite myself. I would be willing to have sex with inappropriate people. I would be willing to be aggressive. I would be willing to do just about anything to make that stop. And I think that of all the important things that's going on in this paragraph, this paragraph's doing a lot of work. But I think of all the important things in here, the most important word might be the word you. Because at this training, he had an audience of nicely dressed professional people, and he looked right into the audience and he said, "You will do anything to make them go away." And he didn't say, if you're some messed up veteran, or if you've got mental problems, or if your IQ's not high. He said, "You." And that's exactly what he meant. He meant you and him and me. Lacking other options, lacking other resources, I can tell you I would be willing to do just about anything not to experience that. The problem is when we see that and we think that it's behavior, right? So what happened in that story was that after they literally dragged him out into the lobby and he'd stopped screaming and he had a chance to sort of come back into himself, he could use words and explain what had been happening. Now imagine, for example, that English isn't his first language, or that he has brain anomalies that already make speech kind of difficult. How then could people understand what was going on? And we tend to look at what people are doing and we assume that it's intentional. There's an attribution bias towards that. If I've got any psych majors in the audience, you guys will know what I'm talking about. So another really important part of you guys being in this training is potentially being the person who can help someone else understand that in those few seconds, that person is not having a behavior. I don't even know what that means anyway, right? Behaviors and thoughts and feelings always go together. We don't just have a behavior, but what my professor experienced in those few seconds was neurologically much closer to a seizure. Right? And so, for example, if I were doing this training, let's say it's live, because I would make it a little bit easier, and I'm talking to you guys, and then suddenly I collapse to the stage and I'm convulsing. I don't think you'd be confused about what was happening, right? I don't think you'd be like, she's behaving in a very odd way. I wonder why she decided to do that. It would probably be pretty apparent to you guys pretty immediately that I'm not in control of what's going on with my body at that moment. And for those few seconds, that's what happened to my professor. It's much closer to a seizure than it is like an intentional act or a decision. But if somebody has a developmental disability, they are much more likely to be treated as if it's a behavior, and they're more likely to be punished. We won't call it punishment, we'll call it a consequence or whatever. But really, that's what it would be. And I want to pause here and say one other thing, which is that I get it. One of the things that we'll talk about with trauma is that it takes you so far out of the context of what's going on that it really can be hard for other people to understand what's going on. Truthfully, if I'd been in that movie theater and This is not a great thing to say, but I'm going to be honest with you. If some guy started screaming and had to be dragged out of the theater, I think I might be likely to go, guy seems like he's right. Like it looks really weird. Um, the thing I think that is important that we'll come back to is how much that takes people out of their own lives. But I want to make one more point about this, and it is um, that point that I made a little bit earlier about trauma is not a thought, trauma is not a memory. It can involve thoughts and memories, but in that moment, my professor was not thinking about Vietnam. He wasn't even remembering Vietnam. In his nervous system, he was in Vietnam. He was in that present moment. And that's another way to understand what van der Kolk is talking about. It's not about the past, it's about the present that keeps you locked into this thing that is happening over and over and over again, as if there is no time, there is no past or present, you just live there forever. Okay, so I think that's a really important uh, common misconception that we very much need to understand if we're going to be responding to people with trauma. And then the last quote that I'll say here before we move on a little bit is the shortest and the simplest, but in some ways it's my favorite. Pierre Janet, just to let you guys know who he was a 19th century French neurologist. And he was sort of at the dawn of what we would think of as like modern brain science. Science was making a bunch of really big leaps as we were starting to learn about the brain. And this is what he said about trauma. Trauma is a disease of not being able to be here. And I think that is so elegant and so heartbreaking because that is really, I think, the damage that trauma causes. If it were simply, you can't go to any more movies about the war, like, I mean, that might be kind of a bummer, but that's not really what we're talking about. Depending on the level of the trauma, the complexity of the trauma, the pervasiveness of the trauma, and honestly, the ability or inability of the people around that person to understand and support what's happening, people are not living the life that they were meant to be in. And let me give you guys an example. So I'm going to sort of open up like who's in our little group here so I can see some of your names. Let me open this up here. Okay, great. Eugenia, that's a beautiful name. I don't know if that's what you go by or if you use a nickname, but that is lovely. Okay, so Eugenia, for our example here, you are going to be a DSP. And let's say you got this new job and you're starting your first day and you brought like donuts for everybody. It's adorable. And there's something about you, I don't know, I can't see, let's say the color of your hair or your height or something like that, or maybe you wear glasses or something. And for whatever reason, it takes my nervous system back to a time when I was in danger from somebody that looked somehow like you. And I take one look at you coming in with your donuts and I punch you right in the face. That would be terrible, right? And a lot of things would immediately happen at that point. But the point here that I really want to make is that is Eugenia really a threat to me? No, of course not. She's wonderful. Oh, and somebody just let me know that I may not see all of your names. Okay, so cool. Hopefully I'll get to see some of your names a little bit later. But Eugenia, I hope you're cool with being my example for right now. So the problem here is that now I can't, she's certainly not going to be my staff person, which would be very understandable. And I may have just lost that job or lost that placement or what have you. And that robs me of the experience of actually getting to know this person or actually being able to be in this place. Depending on how often this happens or how much this is a part of my chart or my behavior plan or whatever, I've had individuals come up to me and say, I'm bad. I've got a plan. I'm dangerous, or whatever. Trauma, as we will see more of later, can affect everything about how I understand myself, how I relate to the world. And I am not relating appropriately to my environment in that moment. I am not in danger with Eugenia any more than my professor was literally in danger when he was in that movie theater in Columbus. And so The reason that I get so excited and passionate when I get to spend time with you guys and talk about this is that you really might be the people who help to understand some of this, or ask for a referral for a trauma therapist, or ask for an assessment, or whatever it is. You might be that individual's best chance to have an opportunity to heal from some of this, and to maybe get to live the life that they're actually in, rather being chronically and tragically out of sync with where they actually are. So I really can't think of anything more important that you guys could be doing. And okay, I have so much to tell you in so little time, so we're going to move on here. We're not going to spend a lot of time with definitions in this training, but I do want to sort of orient you to what are we talking about when we talk about trauma. And the word trauma originates just from the word injury or wound, right? So a medical trauma usually means there's been some damage or injury to the body. Emotional trauma says the same thing about the psyche and the nervous system, right? So trauma is any experience or series of experiences that can make an individual feel that he or she is in danger of dying, or of being emotionally wiped out or annihilated. Another fun quote here from Bessel van der Kolk: an experience becomes traumatic when the human organism becomes overwhelmed and reacts with helplessness and paralysis. This is a really important point. So let me give you guys an example, because all trauma is stress, but not all stress is trauma. So let's say that I'm driving somewhere, and I don't know, outside of Columbus, things get pretty rural if you're heading out on like 71 or 70. So let's say I'm out on kind of a rural section, and I roll, something, I have to swerve or something, and I roll my car into the ditch, and I'm trapped in my car. Now, let's assume for this example that I'm not badly injured. I was wearing my seatbelt. I got, some bumps and bruises, but I'm basically okay. In scenario number one, let's say that I can unbuckle my seatbelt and I can climb my way out of the car, and I've got my phone and I can call for help. Is that situation stressful? Yes, absolutely. Could it be a trauma for me? Sure, it might. That was a pretty scary thing that happened. But now I want you to take the same scenario, and in this case, same level of injury, right? Kind of knocked around a little bit, not seriously injured. That's exactly the same. But this time, the car is crumpled around me and I can't get out, and I can't reach my phone, and it's a rural road, and it might be hours before anybody drives by. And let's say that there's gas leaking from the car and I can smell it, and I think that at any moment, the car's about to catch fire. Is that scenario more likely to be traumatizing than the first one? Absolutely. Why? Because a few things. Number one, it was probably really scary when I rolled the car, but once I got out, if I could get out quickly and realize that I'm okay, I may be less likely to have experienced that as life-threatening. But if I'm trapped in that car and I think that I might be about to be burned to death, yeah, that's a much more real and much longer threat of dying or being very, very badly injured, right? So it's already bigger magnitude. And then the second part that I think is really important for us working with folks with DD is the fact that I'm helpless and I can't get out, and I might be stuck there for hours. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on, but I would simply point out that when many of us in this audience are experiencing some sort of life stress, it might be a really big stress. It might be really, really hard. But if we have an opportunity to do something about it, we can get out of that situation, or we can get out of that dynamic, or we can do something to change it. We have some agency and we have some power. Now ask yourself, how many individuals do we work with who have the same amount of agency that we do? Who can say, I don't want to live in this group home anymore. I want to move. I don't like this county where I'm getting services. I want to be somewhere else. I don't want this roommate. I'm going to live on my own. I mean, I don't want, the decisions my parents are making. I think we're doing better as a field of trying to find more and more ways for people to have that. But there are many folks we work with that have very little power. So it already kind of tilts the scale a little bit about how a stress for them could potentially become a trauma. The other thing I want to say here before we move on is the word emotional is really important here too. So this time I'm going to use myself as the example, but let's say that instead of an adult, I'm 4 years old and I live in a house where there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of yelling, maybe there's a lot of physical violence. The cops are called. I can see it during the day. Maybe I can hear it at night, which is actually a little worse because my imagination is usually coming up with something worse than what I might see. But for whatever reason, no one lays a finger on me. Okay. I am never, ever physically harmed or mistreated. I'm just seeing it and hearing it and witnessing it. Would that be emotionally annihilating levels of stress for me as a child and terror? Absolutely. Right. And so there is interesting research actually that suggests that um, if you do brain scans of different kinds of trauma, someone who experienced, let's say, combat PTSD, and someone who is in a long-term emotionally abusive relationship, and somebody who had experienced a sexual assault um, or ongoing sexual mistreatment, the brain changes that may be visible in those brain scans look the same. So situationally, we may understand them differently, we may treat them differently, but our brains really don't distinguish between them. When something is overwhelming to our nervous system and our ability to cope with it, um, that is potentially traumatizing no matter what the situation is. And so we still tend to treat something that harms the body as somehow worse or more damaging than something that harms the emotions. But that's not how our brain looks at it. So it's important for us to remember that an individual that we're working with, if we think that they've experienced emotional abuse or neglect, that can be every bit as damaging to the brain and the nervous system as if someone had harmed them physically. Okay, so we already talked about that, so we're not going to talk about this. Okay, we're going to talk about this for a minute, and then we'll kind of see where we are. Probably around 4 o'clock, maybe 4:05, we'll take our break. So we'll go a little bit more, and then we'll kind of pause. So, as I mentioned earlier, when you start learning about trauma, and especially when you start learning about triggers, it can be very tempting to kind of just focus there, right? So, if I can go back to Eugenia for a second, um, if she is the staff person working with me and I'm, trying my best to punch her, then, you guys as the managers or whatever might say, well, let's not have Laura work with Eugenia anymore. And, let's say that she wears glasses and we think, maybe it's the glasses. You might say, let's not have Lara work with staff people that wear glasses. Great idea. Certainly, at least in the short term, that sounds like a great plan. The problem with triggers is really two problems. Okay. The first one is that as people start learning about triggers, one of the things they do is they think, okay, well, all we have to do is find out all of Lara's triggers and then we're good. The problem with that, and this is after decades of working with trauma survivors in my practice, is that we don't always know what the triggers are, right? Sometimes you do. Like I said, I think after that experience at the movie theater, my professor didn't go to any more movies about the war. In fact, I'm pretty sure his wife made a rule about it. So sometimes you can identify what that is. But I work with a lot of people for whom we don't really know what it was. And it can sort of lead you on this goose chase trying to figure it out. And we may never figure out what it is. And the reason for that can be that it has to do with how the alarm system in our brain actually works. Okay? So we will talk more about the brain a little bit later today, and even more probably when we meet again next week. But just very briefly, the part of your brain that kind of takes in all the sensory information, everything that's going on around you, what you're noticing inside your body, is your heart calm or is it racing? Is your stomach relaxed or is it upset? All of those forms of perception get filtered through a little part of the brain called the amygdala. And we sometimes call the amygdala the smoke detector of your brain. And those of you who've had any kind of trauma training, or if you've read about trauma or worked with it, you'll be very familiar with this. So what happens when the amygdala gets set off is that it triggers our trauma reaction, which we will talk more about later today. And it's helpful to think about it the way we might think about the smoke detector in your kitchen, which presumably and hopefully you guys all have. So you know how like if you're making toast and you kind of forget about it and you burn the toast, the smoke detector goes off, right? And you know there's not a fire, but you're like, oh, so you got to, throw away the toast and like, get fan the smoke and maybe reset the alarm or whatever. Okay. Well, now imagine that every time that smoke detector gets set off, it gets more sensitive. So the next time it goes off, you didn't burn the toast, you were just making toast and it went off. And then it's more sensitive the next time. So the next time you're not making toast at all, you're cooking something on the stove and the smoke detector goes off. And then after that, you're just running hot water in the sink and the smoke detector goes off. Every time it gets more sensitive until finally it might be at the point where you're fast asleep at night and there's nobody in the kitchen and the smoke detector goes off. People who experience trauma, especially if that trauma is early or repeated or severe, which we'll talk more about, the brain kind of learns trauma like it learns anything else. So it's like we have a smoke detector that's learning to go off more and more and more and more and more, which means you may be in a position where you never figure out at any given moment what triggered you. Fortunately, we don't really need to know that in the way that sometimes people think that we do. We just need to know what to do when it's happening. But it can be something that people can kind of get really fixated on. And again, it can lead to a lot of frustration. But that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem with focusing only on triggers is that it misses what the more global effects of trauma can be. So again, if I told you that I was an Iraq vet and that I can't go to the fireworks on the 4th of July because it's too triggering for me, you'd be like, yep, totally get that. And that's pretty easy to do. But as we'll keep seeing, when trauma happens, especially if it's that sort of horrible trifecta of early in life, I'm going to say 0 to 7, but especially 0 to 3, when trauma is severe, when trauma is repeated. So it may be something that happens over and over again, like somebody who is in an abusive or an exploitive relationship, and it happens over and over and over and over. Um, Early, chronic, severe, trauma can affect everything about your body and your psyche and how you think about yourself and how you think about the world. The best analogy I can give you is this. I used to talk about this with my grad students. Imagine a ship that's on the ocean and there's a hole under the waterline that nobody knows about, and water is starting to leak into that boat. Where would the water be at first? It would be where the leak is, right? But if nobody knows about it and it keeps going, where does that seawater go? Well, it goes everywhere. It seeps into everything, right? Sooner or later, it will get into every part of that boat. And with enough time, it can pull that boat right down under the water. And so when we talk about the things that trauma can affect, it's not just, I can't be around, nice ladies with glasses. It can be how I feel my body, how aware I am of my body. Again, we'll talk more, but essentially, if my body is capable of feeling that level of terror and horror, like my professor leaping out of a chair and screaming, I can't tolerate that. So what I might do is kind of cut off my body awareness. A lot of the clients I work with don't feel their bodies very much. They're pretty numbed out. Or they may go back and forth between feeling excruciatingly aware of their body if they're having like a fight or flight panic reaction, or numb, nothing, just completely cutting it off. In order to know how I'm feeling emotionally, I've got to feel my body. Our emotions are in the body. So think about all the different expressions for emotion. I had butterflies in my stomach. My heart dropped. Um, I don't know, whatever example of that you want to use. So if I can't feel my body, I can't feel my feelings. And if I'm busy trying not to feel and not to think, and especially if I'm using anything to numb that, I'm using alcohol or drugs or food or gambling or whatever it is, then I am very distracted and I don't even know what I'm thinking about what's going on. It can also affect how I see and understand other people, right? So I spent a long time, I would say maybe the first 20 years or so of my career working with teenagers, whom I deeply love. I think of teenagers, I don't know if any of you guys work with teenagers, or maybe you have some at your house right now. Um, I think of teenagers as the pineapple on pizza of people. Like they separate people into camps very quickly. And I'm one of those people who really enjoyed working with teenagers. But there were so many situations where I would think if that kid had had 2 more seconds to think before throwing that punch. I would work with kids where if somebody bumped them in the hallway at school, they instantly reacted as if that person had done that on purpose and they needed to react violently or whatever it is. Um, how you understand uh, and react to other people, how you get your needs met, how you imagine your future, how quickly and accurately you respond to your own environment. We already talked about that sometimes people with traumatic stress and traumatic damage to the brain and nervous system are slowed because they may have sort of checked out. And that's how people may be more vulnerable to future trauma. We know that some people who have a trauma history are at higher risk for having more trauma in the future. And part of that might be because they kind of check out when there's a red flag rather than responding appropriately. Or, as I already mentioned, it can go the other way and you've already turned around swinging. If any of you have ever worked in environments like this, you probably know what I'm talking about. But when I worked in hospitalization settings, there were patients that we were told, do not walk up behind them and put your hand on their shoulder before they see you because they will turn around swinging. Right? How much you can ever relax in your own skin. We're going to talk a lot about this. This is called hypervigilance. That might be something you're familiar with. But basically, think of it as you are always on red alert all the time. So, what does that do to people? Well, we know that when you are flooded with cortisol and those stress chemicals all the time, it can hasten aging. It can make that start happening faster in your body. It can perhaps trigger some autoimmune issues. So if you can imagine that if I'm born with maybe a genetic propensity to an autoimmune issue, if I've got chronic stress, that might be one of the on switches, right? It's complicated. I don't want to suggest that that's the only thing going on. But more and more research is suggesting that those two things may have a role with each other. It can lower your immune system. It really messes with sleep, right? Sleep, I think of as the canary in the coal mine, that sleep is actually a pretty complex process in your brain. And there are lots of different parts of the brain involved with it, and it's very sensitive. It does not take much stress to throw it out of whack. Same with sex, incidentally. You can go through the motions of sex, but to be present and connected during sex, that's a pretty narrow window neurologically to be sort of activated and energized, but also very relaxed. It doesn't take much to throw that out the window too. So it's not uncommon for me as a therapist that someone will come in and they may not identify trauma as an issue, but they may be saying, among other things, like, well, I can't sleep and my sex life is all out of whack. Those are things that I've learned to look at to potentially indicate that this is someone who's struggling with hypervigilance. One last thing about that. If you work with individuals who are, have these like mystery headaches or mystery stomach aches, and they're just trying to get out of something, well, maybe. Or it may be that these mysterious things that it's hard to find a medical cause for are because they're walking around stressed out of their gourd a lot of the time. And that can create headaches and IBS flares and stomach aches and a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to move through these things kind of quickly. We've already talked about it can affect how you fall asleep. It can absolutely affect how you digest food. Chronic stress is a major cause of some things like IBS or other digestive issues, GERD, perhaps whatever. How you understand emotions and feel empathy for others. I want to talk about this briefly because it's not uncommon for me to work with people who say that they are working with someone who has, if they're a teenager, if any of you are in the kid world, a conduct disorder, which is sort of like baby criminal. Because when you can't be diagnosed with antisocial personality until you're 18, but many teenagers who have been diagnosed with conduct disorder are going to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. We could talk a lot about that and how I feel about that diagnostic category. I think there are a lot of problems with it. But one of the problems is this, that one of the criteria for those diagnoses is lack of empathy. Probably heard that before. And without going deeply into the brain science of it, let me just explain it to you like this. So if I'm looking at Dave, I'll pick someone else. So Dave, one of the Daves, you're the example, and your face is doing, your face is red and your eyebrows are frowny and you're like, then what actually happens in fractions of a second, I am not aware of it. It's way too fast. But what actually happens is I see you or hear the tone of your voice or whatever, and then it kind of bounces off me. And there's some potentially like some resonance circuits in the brain. And what happens is I recognize that because I can feel it and I go, when my face does that and my mouth is like this and I'm whatever, I feel angry. I think Dave is angry or sad or happy or whatever. Now, again, fractions of a second, you are not aware that you're doing it. My guess is that everybody in the audience today is very good at empathy. You've got a very quick, very robust circuit to sort of ping pong that off of you. But now think about what happens if all of this is shut down. If I can't feel my own feelings, if I'm not present in my own body, then there's nothing for that to bounce off of. And so that starts to look like I don't have empathy for other people. Now, some of the folks we work with have grown up in environments where acting as if you don't have empathy, hurting people before they hurt you, being very aggressive, using people as objects or barriers to what you want, that can also be a learned behavior style. But when we're talking about it in terms of how trauma can damage us, if trauma makes it hard for you to feel yourself and therefore feel other people, suddenly you are someone who lacks empathy. And in fact, we know from studies that if you work with, let's say, the juvenile delinquent population or adults who are incarcerated, and you treat them for trauma, which many, 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 many of them have, suddenly these people who lack empathy can have empathy. And so there, I think, are a fair number of people that have been labeled sociopathic or lacking empathy who perhaps are actually traumatized. The rest of it you kind of get. How you take risks or tolerate discomfort. Imagine how much your life would have to be on lockdown to prevent you getting triggered, especially if it feels like something like what my professor went through in that movie theater. Relaxing enough to take a risk or to trust somebody or to tolerate the discomfort of something new becomes a whole different ballgame. And I find that we ask our individuals to do that a lot, right? Come on, Lara, let's try using your words. Let's go do this new skill that you learn. Let's go start this new job. And of course, I'm not saying those are bad things for us to be doing, but I do suspect that with some of the folks we work with, we vastly underestimate just how terrifying that actually can be. And of course, how you've been treated by other people informs how you see yourself. How other people behave informs how you see them. So if you've been taught to see yourself as not very valuable because you're not being treated as someone valuable, if you've experienced other people as being unpredictable and dangerous and scary, then that's how you're going to move through the world. So we start to see through this very quick list that trauma is not just potentially a trigger. Trauma can be everything. That seawater may have gotten into every little corner of that boat. And that's why we need to understand trauma much bigger than just the triggers. So I'm going to go a little bit further and then we're going to take our break. Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about what trauma therapists like to call big T trauma or capital T trauma. And an easy way to think about this is this might be something that only has to happen to you once for you to potentially have problems with it. Okay, so let's talk about the hurricane that recently hit North Carolina. And my home was destroyed and I was without power for 2 weeks and I didn't know where I was going to get fresh water. And I lived through that experience. And then I told you that I was struggling with some symptoms of PTSD afterwards. You probably wouldn't be surprised, right? You wouldn't say, just the one hurricane that one time? Interesting, weird, okay. right? That could be a once in a lifetime event, but it could be profoundly, catastrophically disruptive to me in terms of overwhelming my ability to cope, overwhelmingly terrifying, overwhelmingly powerless. So the things on this list are things that could easily be those things. Now, they may also be repeated as well, right? But things like sexual assault, physical assault, ongoing abuse or manipulation, war, surviving a man-made disaster, traumatic grief, humiliation, or bullying. You guys get it, right? This would be a pretty good list of big T trauma. And there's some things that we can talk about. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. But there's some factors that can make a trauma, as we've said, kind of go from stressful to traumatizing. And that can be how long it lasted, how intense it was, what time of day, which is interesting, right? Things that happen at night tend to be more potentially traumatizing than in the daytime because we maybe can't see and we can't orient ourselves as easily. Was there any warning? Did we have any chance to prepare? Was it intentional? Was someone trying to hurt us? So you guys kind of get it. And the most important thing, research shows again and again, that one of the most predictive factors for whether something will become traumatizing for someone is the support system they had during and especially after the traumatizing event. That when people have support during and after an event, they are much less likely, could of course still happen, but they are less likely to have that stress manifest later as post-traumatic stress. There are also some inherent stressors. Previous history, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. If you have a history or a family history of any kind of mental illness or emotional dysregulation, we do know that inherent resilience and vulnerability probably has a genetic component to it. So some people may have a genetic makeup that helps them be a little more resilient to stress, and some people a little bit more vulnerable. Poor relationships, poor attachment to other people. That's sort of the mirror image of what I said before. If you don't have access to healthy, supportive relationships or resources, it puts you at more risk for something to become traumatizing. This is especially true if the trauma was caused by another person, which again is most of the folks we work with. But I want to take one moment and talk about the first thing on this list, previous history of traumas or stressors or abuse. Once again, when you just look at it on this slide, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Like, yeah, if I've had to go through this before, having to go through even more and even more and even more, maybe puts me at greater risk for having symptoms of PTSD. But we don't always think about it that way or experience it that way, depending on who we're dealing with. So I want to take just a moment to talk about this, and then we'll get ready for our break. When I worked with young people, I worked at a number of different youth serving agencies, very good ones for the most part. And they usually had a wide variety of clients that we worked with. Some were suburban kids, some were inner city kids, some were Black, some were white, some were relatively well off, some were dealing with pretty extreme poverty, some were immigrants, some were not. So you get it. And what I noticed was that if a young person had grown up in a situation or had been exposed to things that I would think of as potentially traumatizing, they weren't necessarily seen as being affected by that trauma, depending on how that kid looked. And there is a lot of research to back up what I'm about to tell you. So imagine a girl and a boy, same age, with relatively the same presentation. We know that girls are more likely to be given diagnoses that are emotionally based, depression or anxiety. And trauma is now kind of its own category, but it started out as an anxiety disorder, right? So girls are more likely to be diagnosed emotionally. Boys are more likely to be diagnosed behaviorally. ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, which don't get me started, but I don't think actually exists. I think that's a terrible, dumb diagnosis because how do you have it when you're alone? If you have schizophrenia, you have it whether anyone else is in the room or not. How are you oppositional when there's no one else around? Right. So, and a lot of psychiatrists agree with me that it's maybe not a great diagnosis, but the point here is that it's about behavior, right? Intermittent explosive disorder. I'd like someone to explain that to me. So we already know that there's this bias between girls being sad and boys being bad. And now add race to it. We know that young Black men are far more likely to be given those behavioral diagnoses, especially things like oppositional disorder or conduct disorder or something like that. Um, and girls, much less so. Although we also know that Black girls are vulnerable to their own biases in diagnoses in terms of being seen as more mature or more sexualized than a counterpart who is not a young woman of color. So if it seems like maybe that's just my viewpoint, I assure you there is study after study after study to support what I'm telling you. But I also have this experience, and I'll go through this and then we'll pause here. I was once contracted with an agency, I didn't work there, where they needed a clinical supervisor to sign off on diagnoses. Their director had left abruptly, and they had this backlog of like 200 files. And so I had to, what I would do is read the history that was taken, read the assessment, read the diagnosis, and then I would sign off on it. And so I had a chance to just sit there. I would sit there for a couple hours every day for a few weeks, just kind of going through these files. And I started to notice this trend, and then I decided to count. And I want you guys to guess the number of young men of color who had trauma after trauma in their background, exposure to crime, um, family members or caregivers who are dealing with their own mental illness or addiction issues or violence or whatever you like. Okay. And how many of those kids, I would say it was about half out of the files that I saw. So it was about 100, 125 files. Anyone want to guess the number of young men who were given a diagnosis of PTSD? The answer is zero. Zero. And without getting into the weeds about how diagnoses work, I will just say that like sometimes when you're not quite sure, like it could be this or it could be that, and I'm not sure. And in fairness to this agency, they were often doing this, fairly quickly within hours with a young person. You can give a provisional diagnosis or a rule out. It could be this, it could be that. When I say zero, I'm including rule outs. The number of young men of color given a diagnosis or a provisional diagnosis of PTSD was zero. So, why does this matter to you? Because my guess is none of you guys in this audience, or very few of you, are going to be in a position of diagnosing anybody. It's simply to make 2 points. One is, I believe in the mental health system. I know we have a lot of very skilled, very dedicated people, social workers, nurse practitioners, physicians, psychiatrists who try very hard to do a good job. And so I'm not saying every diagnosis is wrong, but I will say we're all also human beings and we are vulnerable to bias, which research has demonstrated for decades. So just because someone wrote it in a file doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. And more importantly, how you guys are relating to somebody can be affected by how you experience them. So going back to that point that I made about diagnosis, girls are more allowed to be sad, boys are more likely to be seen as bad, means that who gets to be identified as having trauma, be a part of what's going on with them, may be vulnerable to bias. So that's just something that I want to put in there as we think about and talk more about for the rest of our time today and a little bit later. What does diagnosis mean in this population, and what is the incidence of trauma with the folks that we're working with? So this is a good place to pause the screen. So I'm going to pause that, and we're going to have a second for comments.